The ex. I talked to her for a few months after she moved back home, but I found that I'm much better off without her in my life. So we only talked when she contacted me and she eventually stopped. It hurt when she left because despite the hell I had to live through, I cared about her and wanted to help her, even though I really couldn't help her. I haven't talked to her in almost 3 years now, but something happened 3 months ago that somewhat involved her. First, here's a little background. Part of the drama with her was that she was with a friend of mine before me. I first met her at a party at his house when she flew in to see him. I kept catching her staring at me, and it was really weird. It wasn't flirty or anything like that. It was just a really weird stare. I ignored it, and she ended up moving out here and living with him for over a year. How she ended up with me is another long story, but it involved a lot of lies and manipulation on her part, and she kept trying to create conflict between me and him over her. After much agony for both of us, him and I ended up talking and telling each other what was going on. She had been cheating on both of us, and not just with each other. There were more guys than I probably ever know about. It turns out that she had cheated like this on every guy she had ever been with. She has tried to contact him a couple of times over the years, saying that she had dreams about him, but he would just ignore her because he knew he didn't want anything to do with her, and he didn't want to screw up the relationship he was in, which eventually led to marriage. Back when they were together, his mom kept telling him that there was something wrong with her too. Anyway, me and him weren't really close friends back then, but have since become very good friends and currently race cars together. In the middle of August of this year, we were racing at a track out of town, and I ended up sleeping on the couch in the hotel room that he and his wife got. I woke up in the middle of the night after having a very vivid dream about being at the track the next day and seeing huge flames suddenly coming from a car that was out on the track. I couldn't see whose car it was because this track had a lot of overgrown alfalfa, and for some reason, I was in the pits at the time. I could just see flames above all of it. I really remember my dreams, and vivid ones like this are even more rare, so I paid extra attention to it. I had a feeling that it was one of the cars in our class, and that it was his car in particular, but I couldn't say for sure. I mentioned it at breakfast the next day, and his wife kind of freaked out and told me she doesn't want to hear that kind of stuff. We got to the track, and after he took his car out for their practice session, we discovered a huge fuel leak that would have eventually sprayed fuel onto the exhaust header. We replaced the cracked fuel rail and avoided a huge fire. That same day, he gets a text message that just had his name followed by a question mark. He didn't recognize the number and asked me if I knew who it was. I didn't know it either, but I looked at the area code and said, "Where the hell is 513? Then paused for a minute and said, "Wait a minute, that's Cincinnati." I knew this because that's exactly where the psycho girl had moved back to. We don't know anyone else with the 513 number, and we're not quite sure how she got his current number. He just deleted the message and didn't hear anything more, but that sure was an interesting time for that to happen. She was always the one talking about having dreams about him, and dreams that predicted the future. He never really got involved in the paranormal stuff with her though. A few weeks go by, and we're at our next race. He was out for a practice session, and then pulled into the hot pit lane because he smelled a strong odor of fuel. He stopped at the end of the lane, which was just on the other side of the fence from where I had set up camp and was standing at the time. As soon as he stopped, all kinds of flames burst out under his hood. The fire crew starts working on it and opens the hood, and flames shot way up into the air. They got it out, and there was minimal damage, but it was still quite a scene. It turns out that his engine was way out of balance, and the vibrations kept cracking every fuel rail he installed, which wasn't far from the exhaust header. So it eventually cracked in the right spot to spray pressurized fuel right into the hottest part of the exhaust. I fixed the balance issue, he replaced the fuel rail yet again, and the cracking problem didn't come back. Whether you believe this is a coincidence or not, I feel like this event and occurrence has some ties with her. First of all, we received a text message from her, and I had the dreams, and then it actually happened in real life. Because she already had some type of paranormal strangeness to her, I believe this activity was associated with her in a certain way. She must have some type of medium or some way she knew that something bad was going to happen. That's why she texted us. What do you think? Nursing home mysteries. I worked there for 5 years, but I'm done now. Let me explain. I worked at a nursing home and I have seen my share of pretty weird things. I was working the day shift as a dietary aide. For those who don't know what a dietary aide is, in layman's terms, I'm basically in charge of getting food to the correct residents. The nursing home had a bird cage with a bunch of songbirds housed within it. The bird cage stands approximately 6 feet high and spans 8 feet long. Picture a huge box with birds' nests and all the whole nine. Residents love to sit in front of it and watch the songbirds all day long. Anyway, there are 2 rocking chairs and a rocking bench located in front of the bird cage. The bench sits in the middle with the 2 rocking chairs on either side of the bench. On this day, as I'm walking back down to the kitchen, I walked past the bird cage and I noticed one of the chairs rocking back and forth. I didn't think much of it because I thought one of the residents just got up and left. But I was kind of interested. So I stood there and watched this chair rock back and forth for roughly 5 minutes. A lady then walks past me and asked, "What are you looking at?" I proceeded to point at the chair and she said, "Wow, freaky," and left. I thought the rocking would have died down, but it never did. I finally went up to the chair and stopped it. After I walked around the chair to see if the AC was blowing on it, there was no vent in sight. So to test this out, I decided to push the chair and proceeded to watch it rock back and forth. Behold, the rocking chair died down and stopped within a minute. At this point, I walked back down to the kitchen feeling pretty freaked out. Fast forward to a couple months after that incident, I had to drive the cart. This is a little battery powered cart, back down the tunnel. We have those bubble mirrors so we can see around the hallway intersections to keep us from hitting people. Mind you, this is a single hallway with a bunch of old rooms that haven't been used for many years. Most of these rooms have been converted to now storage rooms. As I make my way towards and past the birdcage, I take a look at the mirror, and as I'm passing by, I see this big shadow walk right around the corner, and lo and behold, the chair is rocking. Childhood thrills. When I was 5 years old, my mom had passed away. My dad worked nights, and we were living at my grandpa's house. My uncle had immigrated over from Vietnam and was sleeping on top of a bunk bed, and I was sleeping on the lower portion. Across from the bunk bed was another bed that my dad slept on with a red blanket. One night I was sleeping and woke up to find a pink character straight out of a cartoon, most likely from the 60s. The character had her intestines showing as if I was reading a medical book. Strangely, my mom did die with complications related to medication and overdosage. While I was still laying in bed, I saw this character kind of float in and out of the blanket. And the character was on the bed my dad slept in. He was at work that night. I heard my uncle roll over on the top bunk, and it seemed like this character didn't seem to notice. It also just seemed to mind its own business, not looking over at me or anything else. I was somewhat scared, but I just went ahead and slipped under my blanket and slept. The next day I woke up, and I remember what had happened. I pulled the blanket on my dad's bed and nothing was there. Strange. Eventually we moved out of that house, and side note, my grandpa's mistress also died during the time we were living in that house. She didn't die in the house, but nonetheless, she died in a similar fashion my mom did. My dad and I had moved into another house by the time I was 6. Other people moved in with my dad and I. My relatives had told me that crying causes your parents bad luck if you did it often enough. Perhaps it was a myth to discourage kids from crying or something, but oddly enough, one day I was organizing my NES video games and thought about how much I loved my dad. I started crying at the thought that everyone had to die, and I thought about missing my dad so much. Well, it turns out he gets into a car accident the very next day. Thankfully he was okay, but to make things stranger, there was another time I was laying in bed with my dad and I was crying. talking to him about my mom and just the things that I missed. He got into another car accident that night, and ever since then, I stopped crying about issues related to death. Call it coincidence or not, I cannot explain the occurrences. As I grew up, I sometimes had a dream about my mom. One time I saw her standing at our front gate waiting for me, but I acted like I didn't see her. You know, the behavior as if one was in trouble. The next night I had another dream that she didn't die, and I told her I loved her, hoping that she'd hear me. Nothing else happened except the night following that. My dad was driving us to Portland, Oregon, and around 2 a.m. we drove down this very curvy road. There were a bunch of trees, a big hill, and let me reiterate, super curvy roads. My dad blurted out he saw two people walking on the side of the road but kept on driving. Later the next morning he told me he thought they must have been ghosts. The strangest thing is, he also mentioned that one of them actually looked like my mom. So, I'm not sure what happened there, but perhaps she was trying to tell me something? Who knows? When I turned 12 years old, my cousins moved in with my dad and I. I was doing dishes in the kitchen, but the lights in the kitchen weren't on. The living room light was on, and it was enough light for me to see the dishes. As I'm standing there, it felt like someone had tapped me on the shoulder or was standing behind me. You know, that creepy feeling of something watching you? When I turned around, no one was there, so I felt really weird for a second. I stood there for a couple more seconds and I felt it again. Each time I turned around, I thought it was my cousin, but he was in the living room. I got scared and just left the kitchen altogether. That night when I went to sleep, I experienced a feeling where I can open my eyes, but I couldn't move. My heart began to beat faster and fast, and it felt like I couldn't breathe. Call it sleep paralysis or not, but in many cultures, it's definitely not sleep paralysis. I think that entity that was in the kitchen with me visited me during my sleep. It's quite frightening if you've not experienced it, and I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone.